I think everyone is probably familiar with what the Africa strategy is, but I'll just very quickly recap. So it was sort of initiated in 2018, and there's 5 pillars. So prosperity, security, demography, climate, and then the Sahel, with the science and tech as the enabling function. For the climate and natural resources shift, we have 6 objectives by 2030. So the overall aim is about supporting African economies to become increasingly climate resilient, low carbon and environmentally sustainable. But then we have 6 objectives within that. So one is about national and regional growth plans and sector strategies being climate smart. The second one is around voices. So African countries being more vocal on the world stage in UNFCCC and so on, but also about civil society and young people, about supporting their voices. Then we have one around implementation of Paris Agreement and the NDCs, one around increasing flows of public and private investment to African countries for low carbon and climate resilient development. And then we have 5 is around really a catch-all for programming. It's covering energy, agriculture, water and natural resources management. And then 6, it links to the science and tech one, but it's about understanding and innovation. So understanding of climate and natural resource risk and using that in policy and programming. So that's the sort of overall framework of what the climate shift is. It's across HMG. So in terms of what we've done so far and what's happening this year, one thing which sounds quite processy but actually took a huge amount of time was recruiting a network. So we now have over 20 advisors and others in the region, and that includes 4 regional reps as well as people in individual countries, and then plus posts that are meant to strengthen partnerships in particular areas and with particular institutions. So we have Eleanor in China and various partnerships with Green Climate Fund and with multilateral development banks and others. So that's one of the things we've been up to. We're working very closely with Helen on new programming to support the shift. We've done quite a bit so far that Ahmed, who works with us in the shift, will talk about shortly around working with young people, civil society, capacity building. And then our regional advisors have been busy increasing prioritisation of climate and natural resources in countries and at post, developing regional plans, working with ambassadors for them to become regional champions for climate and natural resources in different countries and across the region. We've also been doing a fair amount on trying to resolve the tensions between the climate and prosperity shifts, thinking about opportunities for collaboration, some of which happened around the Africa Investment Summit and some of which we're following up with DFID and others on. And then we've been more recently working a lot with the COP unit, helping to shape the COP26 strategy for working with African countries. Priorities this year, some of the big ones are around COP. So African countries can be vocal at COP, can talk about, have a more impact perhaps than they've had in the past, and are able to hold other countries to account, and also that we bring in alternative voices as well, young people and others. So 2 are really covering a lot this year, mostly around COP. So the outcome 2 on voices and the Paris Agreement, which is around African countries helping to secure ambitious commitments on emissions reductions. And then this year we're also doing work hopefully on the partnership strand, and we are working with the GCF to try and increase the pipeline of Green Climate Fund programmes from Africa, increase investment there. If you are interested in who's doing what, that's our network. So we have Jane Edmondson and Kath Bremner as the SROs, Kath's in Bays. We also work closely with Nick Bridge and his team in the Foreign Office. We have a steering board cross-government, and then we have people in the region and in institutions, as I've discussed, from FCO, Bays and DFID. and also working closely with the IT. This is a bit more detail about COP. We've been working to think about how we work with African countries. These are some of the points that we've been thinking about. So one of them is working with the influential blockers in Africa, so South Africa and Egypt. The other is trying to create a bit of a more progressive coalition of countries that are like Kenya, Ethiopia, Rwanda, encouraging them to work together and for us to work really closely with them to try and demonstrate what they're doing and encourage others to be more ambitious and progressive. It's slightly tricky now because some of the big events like Africa Climate Week have been cancelled or looking in doubt, like POGM. But the idea was to encourage these countries to come out first and early with new commitments and plans, both in terms of NDCs, but also under the campaigns or the thematic areas, and influence others at the same time. And then also we've been thinking about how we work with institutions like the AU and the African Development Bank, bringing in those alternative voices. So especially with the youth coalition that we've helped set up. That's one of the sort of things we've been looking at in relation to COP. This was part of the analysis we did when we had this strategizing workshop about where the different countries in Africa sit on this matrix of influence versus progressiveness, and how we can work with different groupings in this to try and influence the commitments that are made at COP. This was originally based on something that BEIS do in Latin America. So BEIS have worked really closely with a few countries, Colombia, Mexico. The idea is that it's a sort of whole mission approach to working with that country. So from the ambassador down, they prioritise climate and natural resources. And the idea is that they have a set of agreements, that they're things that they're going to work together on, and also programming and support that comes in behind that. And that really everyone in the embassy has climate and natural resources as part of what they do, and it sort of reorientates the relationship, the HMG relationship with Colombia and Mexico around these priorities. And we've been thinking about how we might adapt that to African countries. I think I understand that the Latin American partnerships took a couple of years to really set up and get going. We've been thinking about how it might work in some African countries and where there are opportunities to do something like this. I think the idea is that it's a long-term partnership, and not just with a Ministry of Environment. The idea is it's with heads of state and ministries of finance and so on, not just with the Ministry of Environment. We think that we need to adapt it a little bit so that it fits with what's already happening in country and how it would work. So, for example, Mandar may want to come in at the end, but we have just signed an agreement with Kenya for a long-term partnership, but it isn't just on climate. We've made climate one of 4 or 5 areas where we'll be prioritising and cooperating with the Kenyan government. So that's one option, that we bring it in as part of a wider cooperation agreement. We also think that in some countries it might work to have more focused ones. Like we've been thinking about Nigeria, a focused one on energy, for example, or you might have one on natural resources. The idea is that it would work, as I said, from commitment from the ambassador who's the champion, a real coordination of cross HMG programming in that country. So everything is making best use of those programs, making sure they're joined up, especially with the doubling of ICF, making sure we have a really clear offer of programs across HMG rather than different departments doing their own thing, and that it would be long term, so lasting as long as we could, and that we would have a sort of lesson learning process built in. So we'd see how it was going and review it at certain points, bring in evidence from other countries and so on. And I think when we've had discussions with posts about this, so we've discussed with Kenya and their agreement has been signed. The other posts we've been thinking about working with at the moment, Nigeria and Ethiopia. And I think, there's lots of issues around that in terms of where they are in the political cycle, but also around the need to have a really clear support offer, especially in the run-up to COP, and being able to articulate that across government is one of the challenges that we've been coming up with. there probably is a little bit of overlap between the different objectives of the shift. I guess the way we've been thinking about it is that, so number 3 about NDCs was really quite focused just on countries producing NDCs and then implementing them effectively. That's, I suppose, quite narrow in that it's linked to the UNFCCC process. It's about the implementation of NDCs. And the history of this is that that one was there separately because as we were I wasn't around at the time, but as Stephen and others were developing the shift and bringing and working closely with BEIS, I think BEIS at the time felt they wanted something specific on NDCs and standalone because that was their departmental lead. And then in effect, 3 feeds into number 1, which is about countries then developing on the back of their NDCs, their national strategies and plans that should be part of the implementation. So there is quite a bit of overlap there. And then 5 around energy, agriculture, water, that is quite broad, but I think the way that we're actually using that in practice is more about HMG support, programming support to those sectors. So it's less, I suppose, about the countries, well, it is about supporting those countries to do that, but it's not about them making commitments or drawing up plans. It's about how we then come in behind that with a programming offer in those areas. I don't know if that helps, but yes, there is overlap. And partly it's historical because of the debate between departments at the time. Yeah, that's how we see them working in practice. I think it is a bit of a gap in the Africa strategy in that we cross shifts, we have shared interest in engaging with particular partners, including the French, China, etc. But there isn't really a coordinated mechanism for doing that yet. So we're kind of slightly either neglecting it or doing it separately, which isn't particularly helpful.